to this rule, but ancient authors explain them for unique and remarkable reasons. Among the Egyptians, the different species of animals were the gods of the different sects, and as these gods continually warring with each other, they engaged their devotees in the same fight. The worshippers of dogs could not remain long in peace with the worshippers of cats or wolves. But when no such reasons existed, the Egyptian superstitions were not as incompatible with the others as is commonly imagined, for we know from Herodotus that Amasis contributed enormous sums to the reconstruction of the temple at Delphos. The intolerance of almost all the religions that have preserved the unity of God is as evident as the contrary principles of the polytheists. The relentless narrow-mindedness of the Jews is well known. Mohammedanism has even bloodier principles. And even today they curse, although they no longer burn or torture all other sects with fire. And if among Christians, English and Dutch, they have embraced the principles of tolerance, this singular fact is due to the firm resolve of the civil magistrates, in opposition to the persistent efforts of priests and fanatics. The disciples of Zoroaster closed the gates of heaven to everyone except magicians. Nothing obstructed the advance of the Persian conquests more than the violent zeal of this people against the temples and images of the Greeks. And after the fall of that empire we see that Alexander, as a polytheist that he was, immediately re-established the cult of the Babylonians that the previous princes, Persians, as monotheists, were so concerned to abolish. For even the blind and devout fidelity of that conqueror to the Greek superstitions not only obstructed the Babylonian rites and ceremony, but he himself offered sacrifices in accordance with them. So open is polytheism that even the greatest ferocity and antagonism that it can find in a contrary religion will hardly ever disgust and keep it at bay. Hume, N.D., ch. 9. 4. The symbolic Canaan. It is necessary for the monotheistic God to enter his promised land again, eliminating and evicting all the pagan peoples that are there to occupy his sacred place. We have already seen the intense expansive, theological, political, and colonialist force contained in monotheistic thought. I have called Canaan symbolic, the process of historical transmutation from Hebrew monotheism to Christian monotheism, and finally to Islamic monotheism. Each monotheism broke into its own promised land which was to be conquered. Each conqueror believed to have been entrusted as part of spiritual Israel to carry out an evident mission, reproducing in fact the biblical account. The claim of new promised lands has spread to the colonized continents, extending beyond the Red Sea, to conquer and dislodge its inhabitants. These indigenous inhabitants became the new victims, replacing the ancient nations expelled by the Israelites. I will send an angel before you to expel the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Exodus 32. The European conquerors had the idea of having been commissioned by God to execute a divine plan and reproduce the Israelite conquest. Cortés himself compared himself to Moses, believing that he was opening a path to a promised land. He assumed that he had rescued the indigenous inhabitants from the Egyptian slavery of sin and idolatry. Let us always bear in mind that the Bible speaks very little of theology, and focuses its attention on the fight against idolatry. The monotheistic God is a jealous God and is in charge of detecting, combating, and eliminating all traces of idolatry, all manifestations of cults to strange gods. Since the arrival of the Spaniards to our continent, attempts were made by all possible means to extirpate idolatry. In Hebrew monotheism we find a colonialist prototype that will later be reproduced by subsequent derived monotheisms, Christianity and Islam. 5. The expiatory urgency. It is necessary to analyze the psychological structure of religions taking into account that they culturally shaped the nations that incorporated them. We must also bear in mind that national political and cultural expressions contain contents that have been historically transmuted from the expansive religious influence. Each monotheistic religion has a certain theological and psychological structure. However, monotheism indicates the elements common to all monotheistic religions. For that reason I make a difference between monotheistic religion and monotheistic centeredness. Generally I speak of monotheism when I refer to a specific monotheism in its different typologies, and when I speak of monotheism I do so generally to refer to the common characteristics between the different monotheisms. I have called as expansionist expiatory urgency to certain religious and psychological traits that are manifested with great intensity in monotheocentrism. An internal compulsion is manifested, an expansionist expiatory urge, a force that tends to delay the mission and the extension of the kingdom of God on earth, through the conviction of an evident universal mission. There is an urgent obligation that demands immediate preaching and the fight against idolatry to rescue souls from eternal torture with the greatest possible haste. This thought gains intensity, when interpreting that salvation can only be obtained through faith and not through works. In the Catholic typology, works can also become a means to achieve salvation, and not only faith, which would attenuate from a psychological aspect the expansive and missionary impulse, that is, if humanity can also be saved through works, the expiatory urgency would not be necessary with the expansive end of salvation, because through his own efforts he would have another possibility to achieve it. For Protestant monotheism, all mortals are inexorably headed for eternal damnation, regardless of whether or not they have learned of the salvific redemptive message. As long as a person has life, he still has the possibility of redemption, therefore it is necessary to hurry, to spread the message of salvation throughout all continents, in order to avoid his immediate condemnation. Understanding these theological and psychological aspects is very important to understand the colonialist expansion, since these same religious contents are those that have been transmuted under political forms from where the haste to expand the saving, religious message has been transmuted under substitute forms through other impulses secondary reaching various destinations. Colonialist policy was driven by the same monotheistic and expansionist forces of the past. These already secularized forces did not focus their attention on saving souls from eternal fire, but on saving the savages from their own idolatry, totally stripping them of their identity, from which the idea of a divine mission transmuted under the idea of nature. God or providence will no longer be the object of rationalizations or justifications. Now they will be natural forces, biology, destiny, the nation. The monotheocentric expansionist haste was transmuted into political expansionist haste. The expiatory urgency was transformed into an imperialist urgency. 6. The construction of the heretic. We are not surprised that the concept of heretic, and of heresiarch has emerged from a structure of ideas, beliefs, concepts, affections, and interpretations inspired by the monotheocentric historical influence. This one truth resists all other forms of belief and opinion. Every attempt to modify the divinely established and inspired truth implies an affront to the providence that inspired it, and to its children, the brothers, the community of the faithful, the chosen, the devotees, the predestined, saved. As the concept of truth dissipates, it will lose its monothecentric character, achieving a certain rapprochement by valuing, integrating, sharing, accepting, respecting and working with other truths as legitimate as yours. This way you will become more tolerant. You will be able to accept diverse thinking without having the demand to be the only one, thus avoiding endless debates in order to point out the error of the other. Because this concept of truth has dissipated, the concept of expiatory urgency will at the same time dissipate. All those who deviate from the only divinely established and hegemonic truth, become a heretic. From Catholic monotheism, Saint Augustine said that it is not a heretic who errs in the faith, but who, having manifested the Catholic faith, has chosen to resist it. De Baptism 4, 16,23. The heresies went from a religious plane to an already secularized political plane. They were no longer transmuted as religious heresies, but as political heresies. The accusing finger has changed direction, where the new heresies became the political systems that threatened the hegemony of the colonizing nations. Imperialism should avoid at all costs that the nations of our continent embrace these heretical ideas which threatened their interests. In the United States, Protestant religious contents have descended from the pulpits to be transmuted into politics and continue the construction of new heresies and heresiarches. Heresy is not only presented from a religious perspective, it is not only idolaters and worshippers of dead rock-carved idols that remain heretics. Docetism, Gnosticism, Monophysism, Nestorianism, Pelagian doctrine, represented the ancient heretics of the first centuries of our era. Now the new heretics belong to the political systems that resist the hegemonic imperialist forces. In this way we can speak of a monotheocentric politics because it has historically received the influence of certain absolutist contents from the monotheistic religion. We must not accept the term heresy or heresiarch as universal, but as a construction proper to Christian monotheism. Before the emergence of Christianity there was no concept of heretic. This concept was born with monotheism. The heretic has been determined as such, by an absolute truth that demands the absolute submission of all mortals. Relentlessly. The concept of heretic was born between 1220 and 1250, and means partisan, sectarian, I embrace a party, I lame, I choose, Corominas, 1997. 7. The monotheocentric watchful eye. He is conceived as a demanding, jealous God, who constantly controls the actions of mortals, who throws into eternal torments even those who have not had even a hint of knowledge of his law. It is about a spy God, whose eyes are everywhere, a God who hears everything, who sees everything, and who can listen to conversations, without being seen by mortals. This divine model has the commission to watch and punish, and reminds us of the panopticon device described by Michel Foucault. I believe that this device constitutes one of the destinations for the transmutation of the watchful eye in Western culture. I believe that despite his skepticism on religious matters, Jeremy Bentham was compelled to reproduce his prison model inspired by these same monotheistic unconscious forces. The monotheistic God does not share his glory with anyone. Creation is the work of his hands, and only his, compressing into himself an enormous expansive force, soon to be released. Its contents have been transmuted into scientific thought, expanding from a single religious truth to a single scientific and cultural truth, in such a way that we can also speak of a political, economic, scientific monotheism. While Comte's positivism celebrates having shed all religious concepts, it actually continued its existence under the monotheocentric influence by viewing itself as the only true science. The pyramidal devices, in a certain sense, conserve the influence of these historical ideas that have been inspired from the beginning, starting from religious theological conceptions. Positivism, writes Gavilan Pinto, saw in this science sociology the answer to all the problems of man and society, to such an extent that it became a true university religion. Comte himself went on to point out that positivism or positive science is the only one that can find the laws that govern not only nature, but also our own social history based on the progress of humanity. Nationalism, and later philosophical positivism, with its increasing development of the sciences, ended up imposing linear thought in the West. Linear thinking is almost always abstract and sets objectives in isolated and totally independent developments. It does not interact with the remaining parts of its environment. The linear thinking man works only for his own goal, regardless of who is next to him. Pinto, N.D., pages 46 to 47. Returning to the original nations that have spread from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, we must point out the importance of community life, participatory democracy, reciprocity, the collective importance of work, ritual, communion with the laws of the cosmos, respect for the elderly who are valued for their experience, for being guides and holders of wisdom in the community. Beyond the existence of many warlike and warlike nations, the general concept of the earth and nature are sacred. Nature has life in itself, they feel, hear, breathe, in such a way that we can and must link with nature. She is one more member of the community, she is confused with the same indivisible reality with the Great Spirit. The sun is generous, because it illuminates us all equally, and in the same way, the Great Spirit gives His grace to all existence without exception. Therefore, we must value and take care of everything, since we are enlightened and cared for by the Great Spirit, and if someone so powerful takes care of us, we must do the same with others, following the example of creation. The light that illuminates us, dislodges the darkness of the night, and brings us happiness, allows us to see intelligent nature, and at the same time be seen by it. Just as we have eyes that allow us to see, the heart also has the ability to see. Nature, the cycle of the moon, the light of the sun, represent a source of inspiration that teaches us, and makes us wise. Everything has a meaning, and it exists for the purpose of teaching us something. Sunlight or light reflected by the moon, the light of the stars, fulfill the sacred function of illuminating nature. The term people is applied to both humans and animals. This indistinct concept induces them to value animal life, and to take as a consequence only what is necessary for the sustenance of life. In every essential thing that we extract from nature, we are sacrificing a part of it for our benefit. This thought leaves no place for predation. It is unthinkable for them to damage nature. It has a life similar to human life. It is able to see, feel, and hear, in the same way. The universe must be treated with respect, because it existed before the arrival of the 2-foot people. In this we see the preeminence of one previous existence over the next, and a sense of respect for pre-existence. In the same way, there is a venerable respect for the elderly. They were born earlier and therefore have more experience than the rest of the community. The earth is compared to a woman, the mother, or the grandmother. Therefore, she was born before us and deserves to be respected. The matriarchal nature acquires greater importance in indigenous thought, being related to food, care, birth, the womb, germination, flowering, growth, childbirth. In Quiche thought, described in the Popol Vuh, the gods have characteristics similar to mortals. They dialogue with each other, create, consult, meditate among themselves, agree, put their words and thoughts together. In the Mayan creation there is no single sudden decision, it is collective. There are heterogeneous gods who dialogue, who communicate with each other, consulting, meditating, putting their words and thoughts together to reach a creative agreement, through a process that demands communication with another, and in which the gods make mistakes and they repair it, through a creative process of trial and error. These errors are collective. They recognize their own creative impotence and the tragic consequences of that impotence, which does not happen with the almighty monotheistic God. The gods need to be recognized, remembered, fed, named. They need the recognition of the other. On the other hand, the monotheocentric God does not need his creation. While it is true that in the same way that the monotheistic God, the frustration of the gods led them to the violent destruction of creation, nevertheless, they recognize their impotence, and destroy the created because they could not make beings think and speak with their Creator and their Maker, who had made them, who had created them. This human created by the gods will be the result of dialogue and not of a decision taken unilaterally. The creation of the gods is participatory, one God builds together with the other. Therefore creation is the product of dialogue, of the collective, the social. In monotheistic creation, collective participation is not necessary, since deific decisions are made by a single God. Instead, the gods are conceived as mother and father. Say, then, our names, praise us, your mother, your father. Popol Vuh, 1991, p. 26. Although the matriarchal aspects cannot be totally excluded from the human psyche, and in addition in the Hebrew Bible we find books that present matriarchal features, the monotheistic God is contemplated under a patriarchal nature. The first created man and woman had a father, but there is no creative female representation. This reality has influenced Western thinking, since law, justice, and conditional love, typical of patriarchal nature, will be ranked over unconditional love, and other complementary aspects typical of matriarchal nature. For the Mapuche, the great spirit of the universe, Njinfuka, created first the woman and then the man. The woman is the protagonist and significant in Mapuche life. She represents fertility. Mother Earth, man, and woman complement each other. The gods want to be worshipped by naming them, by pronouncing their names. This thought contrasts with the idea of the monotheistic God, since his name remains taboo, hidden from mortals. The ineffable name of the Hebrew monotheistic God is unpronounceable, and instead different names are used to substitute it, and whose purpose is to appease anxiety and avoid the error of naming it incorrectly, the consequence of which is punishment. This God is far from the human, he is highly feared, and a certain approximation can only be achieved through bloody sacrifices or substitute, mediatory, Christological or sacred messianic forms. It is about a jealous God who forbids the Israelites to mention the pagan name of the gods, and yet does not reveal his own name to them. The chosen people must never pronounce the name of other gods, but neither will they be able to pronounce the name of their God. Ex 23:13. This concept contrasts remarkably with quiche thought, whose gods establish a more direct link with their creation, where the created human has to sustain and feed the original gods. These gods are not self-sufficient, they depend on their creation, they need to be invoked, valued, exalted, recognized, fed. Popolva, 1991, p. 28. Human creation has come into existence as such, due to a series of previous trials and errors, therefore the human being is the product of a process where the mistakes and the success of their gods played a very important role. On the other hand, the monotheistic God is self-sufficient, he did not need to elaborate any previous process because he can never make mistakes, and therefore he does not require the cooperation of other gods or mythological beings to build his creation. That eternal God has not been able to contemplate the immortality of his creation. The curse that embodies human mortality should not be explained as an error of God, but as the payment of the sin of the human being. The monotheistic God does not make mistakes. He will always be just, unequivocal, perfect, while his creation is guilty of his sinful and deadly situation. Every error is the product of the corrupted nature of man, of his disobedience, but never of a divine error. This idea that was born in monotheistic theology, has been transmuted in time and space, giving rise to the Western concept of an innate and depraved human nature. The idea that the human being is bad by nature, responds to this influence. Psalm 14:3. This way of interpreting the facts generates a feeling of guilt, distrust towards the human being himself, and even intolerance and religious fundamentalism, because if there is only one truth, and that truth belongs exclusively to a single creator God, then all manifestation polymite, any difference, will be interpreted as heresy, as an affront to the only true thing. It is also important to consider what was expressed by Professor Juan Antonio Estrada. The absolutization of one's own beliefs, together with man's existential insecurity and the involvement of religions in the constitution and maintenance of society as channels and managers of human aggressiveness, is what explains the potential for religious violence. In this sense, there is no difference between monotheistic and polytheistic religions, since they all exercise similar functions although in different ways in society. What is specific about monotheism with respect to polytheism is not in the absence or not of violence, but in the way of managing it and in the different dimensions that it has in the different religious typologies. Polytheism, symbolized by the pantheon of the gods, has a greater tolerance and capacity for dialogue regarding the various beliefs, since all of them are assumed, integrated and respected, breaking with the idea of a monolithic and one truth. Here there is respect for plurality and the specific features of each tradition without attempting to substitute uniformity for it. Estrada, N.D., pages 293 to 294. There is a close relationship between what we could call the emergence of a social polytheism and tolerance for diversity, ecumenical movements, theological multi-membership, and multidimensionality. Griffiths realizes the stark violence that defines West from East. According to him, people are dominated by the conscious mind, locked in their own self, where the masculine aspect dominates, the rational, active, and aggressive power of the spirit, defining Western society as an automaton. There is a kind of fixed determination in their spirit that makes their movements and gestures stiff and clumsy, and that everyone tends to wear the same drab dresses. After the years spent in India, this is still my deepest impression. There is much poverty and misery in India, but especially in the villages and among the poorest, there is an abundance of life and joy. Griffiths, 1982, pages 8 to 9. Griffiths observes that the violent influence of the West can lead to the destruction of the ancient cultures of the East. I must insist that it was after the First World War that thinkers arose who began to look at the East with greater attention. It was considered necessary to understand the causes of this violence, of these catastrophes that the Great Wars brought with them. Our European culture, civilized, industrialized, Christian, and proud, destined to lead the vanguard of its technological and scientific advances, seemed to come to an end. This inspired Griffiths to say, "I need to discover the other half of my soul." Griffiths, 1982, p. 8. As we have seen, monotheistic creation maintains a distance from nature, which is in a certain way inferior to man, considered as the pinnacle of divine creation, the center and navel of creation. Human preeminence somehow enables to own creation as its owner. Water, air, animals, and life are secondary elements, created to serve man. They do not have in themselves a sacred character. The lack of the sacred element in nature enabled manipulation, utilitarianism, pollution, and even the depredation of life. The monotheistic God does not remain immanent in his creation as an indivisible whole. It is projected above it, we find it up there, in the heights. Therefore we can speak of a mechanistic monotheism, where nature is composed of different parts independent of each other, and replaceable. Bede Griffiths referred to Christianity understanding that its theology is Greek, its organization Roman, and its cultural expression European. Griffiths, 1982, p. 11. When monotheocentric thought shares the ecumenical, mystical, tolerant, and inclusive idea, it will be overcoming its rigid fragmentary structure. From my point of view, Christian monotheism has unconsciously sought to find in the creation of a Trinitarian doctrine, in the introduction of the Marian cult, in the mediation of a woman as mother of the deity, in the belief of various mediators and saints between God and human beings, a way to weaken the patriarchal influence of Hebrew monotheism, and an attempt to build the cosmic complementarity that was needed. Griffiths noticed this original monotheistic lack, and tried to find that cosmological unity in the complementary study giving rise to Eastern and Middle Eastern religions, stating that it might seem that the Christian churches have to recover that perspective which is that of the New Testament if it is who really want to regain their meaning in today's world. Griffiths, 1982, p. 35. In the worldview of our original nations, and in the religions of the East, China and India, there is a complementary and divisible feminine and masculine principle. In the Hindu religion, there is the active principle Purusha, and the feminine principle Prakriti. However, in monotheism, and in the Christian tradition, there has been very little recognition of this feminine aspect of God. However, God is father and mother, and in the Eastern tradition this has always been recognized. Griffiths, 1982, p. 51. While it is impossible to escape the matriarchal principle, monotheism tends to suffocate it, lacking a comprehensive view of reality. Therefore, it is necessary to move towards the past, until we find ourselves face to face with the complementary and integrating vision of the cultures that have been contemptuously called savages by the colonialist worldview. Our Western way of life will not be able to stand up without a change in its worldview. It is not the task in these chapters, to go into theological details, but to carry out a psychological and historical analysis to understand the great differences that have marked certain dissimilar features both in East and in West. However, it is not easy to carry out this work, ignoring the theological aspects to which we necessarily have to go to understand the facts. We must bear in mind that the analysis of religious aspects is extremely important to discern our current historical reality. We have already seen that religion contains a pristine material that has been transmuted in time and space under various substitutionary manifestations, in such a way that our current thoughts are the result of a construction of long historical processes that gradually changed, taking as genesis religious influence. The monotheistic God is far above that universe that he himself has created. We are not to find it within or integrated into each created thing. He is a God who has built a one-sided relationship with his creation, a God who does not need the human being. He can never and should never become like him. He will always need his creator without being needed. Since it is a jealous God, the monotheistic God demands the only devotion, but at the same time does not need the worshipper. In the different Abrahamic religions a conflict is manifested by the preeminence of one monotheism over the other, by the exaltation of a single truth over the other. Its different typologies litigate each other, imposing one over the other. It is contradictory that all humans defend a single truth and at the same time are tolerant of pluralistic ideas. It must be assumed that each monotheism contains the truth in a pure and absolute state, therefore, that truth expresses the will of the only true God. All hold the possession of the truth, therefore it must be restricted in each of the different typologies, and in a broad sense in the rest of humanity. If we are to suppose that there is only one truth and that the monotheistic God, whatever his typology, is the only possessor and the only means to escape worldly sinful condemnation, then this idea will demand unconditional and permanent submission. Once he has made the decision to believe, the human will be forced to remain subject to this one truth forever. If at any time you decide to abandon it, you must bear in mind that you will be exposed under the wrath of God, because outside of that truth there is no place to shelter, since there is no other truth. The monotheistic God appears compassionate and merciful, but at the same time rages against all creation that does not obey his precepts to the letter. He loves those who belong to him, those who submit to his power, his faithful, his predestined, his church, his people, his believers, his community, and he loves them because they obey him, because they obey that one truth. Therefore, he establishes a rupture between him and the humans who do not belong to him, between him and those who are outside or left the limits of sacred space. The monotheistic God demands a single adoration. He must be worshipped only because he is unique, because he is capable of creating without the help of anyone, because he has no partners, because he can achieve it by himself, because he is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. Say, he is Allah, the only divinity. Allah is the absolute of whom everyone needs, and he does not need anybody. He did not beget, nor was he begotten. There is nothing and no one who resembles him. Surah 112, 1-14. God has not adopted a son, nor is there another God next to him. If so, each God would have claimed what he had created and some would have been superior to others. Glory to God above those who attribute to him. He is the knower of the hidden and the manifest. He is exalted from what is associated with him. Surah 23, 91-92. The monotheistic God is really the expression of self-sufficiency, the declaration of war against the different. It is proprietary, exclusive, sectarian, arrogant, intolerant, arrogant, and haughty. Not only does he not need his creation, this being not enough, he demands from the being he has created, that cursed, limited and mortal being, the only adoration, condemning him if he does not do so. This idea brings with it a deep distrust and disbelief in the collective work with the different, the heterogeneous, the solidarity, the integral. Let us carefully observe that all forms of opposition to pluralism, to diversity, are basically inspired by religious forces of a monotheocentric character. The other becomes a stranger whom I must distrust, especially if he does not think in the same way and if he does not share the only truth. I have to make sure that the other thinks the same as me. Monotheism interprets unity under the imposition of force, law, authority, and submission. Unity is not built among all, it is imposed from the outside by a God who distrusts the being he has created. The authority must necessarily rest with one. The diverse thought cannot be part of this divine unity. Only one sovereign and many subordinates can be conceived, the possessor of a single absolute power, and those who unconditionally obey that power. The only way that order can manifest itself in the world is through the existence of a single sovereign God. Beings do not want to be badly governed. It is not good that many sinned, it is better that there be only one man. Aristotle quotes the Iliad in Book 12 of his Metaphysics. According to Philo, the God of Israel has universal claims. He is the God of the cosmos, and his people have been chosen from among the peoples of the earth. Israel is the priest of humanity. However, as monotheocentrism loses its claims to a single truth, a universal priesthood, it will make itself more tolerant of differences. For this to be possible, this concept must be dispelled to enter into harmony with other different creeds, accepting the existence of other truths, which makes discussion possible. I consider two manifestations of dilution of this monotheistic truth. which facilitate its integration and prepare it for a more tolerant experience in the face of difference. Primary dilution. Through this dilution, monotheism comes into concordance with other religions, also monotheistic, thus diluting in both typologies the concept of the only truth. Secondary dilution. This dilution is much less frequent. Monotheism comes into concordance not only with other monotheistic religions, but also with religions, Oriental philosophies and many other creeds, diluting much more its character of unique truth. The one God now shares his truth with other truths and deities very different from his own. Its monotheistic character has been diluted to become an ecumenical religion. Secondary dissolution produces the truth modification to a greater degree, adapting it to different realities. At this stage, biblical theological concepts are no longer interpreted as literal, but as symbolic and mythical, preserving faith in a God who is not alone and whose truth is not the only one. Bede Griffith somewhat dilutes the universal claims of Christianity by integrating and complementing it with Hinduism. We have already seen that monotheism practiced in its Calvinist Protestant typology shaped the thinking of many nations including the United States. When the first English arrived in the New World for the first time, they believed they had reached a promised land offered by God. This reality also occurred with the Spanish Empire. In the prologue of the work called Historia de la Vida y Viajes de Cristobal Colon of the Count of Rosoli de Lorgues, Columbus appears as a messiah, a prophet, an intermediary between God and the indigenous nations of the New World. The Count of Rosoli begins his work by saying that God, when finishing his work of creation, left the universe subject to fixed and exact rules from which he could not separate, and by putting man in possession of everything created, he imposed on him, among other precepts, that of filling the earth. Gradually through the centuries, the globe was populated by generations. One day, the Son of God, the Son of him who had commanded man to fill the earth, knowing that his Father's precept was already fulfilled, said to the heralds of his law, "Go, and teach all nations." The precept had to be fulfilled because it was also God who gave it. His disciples were scattered, and the whole known world heard the voice of the messengers of the crucified. But were there other people to teach? Was the land that man had to fill fully known? Nobody cared about it. Nobody suspected that the immense canvas of water that bathed the western coasts of Africa, was limited by the beaches of another more western continent. Was the precept of the Son of God already complete? Perhaps it was partially, but we were ignorant of it. It had to be fulfilled entirely. Europe ignored him, but he saw afterwards the divine mandate fulfilled, because the word of God does not pass. And the favorite nation, the one chosen to carry out this colossal undertaking, the largest ever entrusted to any people, was the Spanish, by special provision of providence. A man, a chosen one of God, because it could not be otherwise, will dream, delirium, in his dreams he will glimpse a world full of poetry, full of natural wonders, inhabited by his brothers. He will run from city to city all over Europe, offering a new world to the kings and the powerful, and they and the kings will laugh at their dreams like ancient kings of the Bible mocked the visions of the prophets of the God of Israel. And when man, Colossus for his genius, but man, burdened by disappointments, exhausted by fatigue, full of bitterness the soul, is ready to yield to the general contempt, then a magnanimous heart will emerge, a privileged intelligence, a strong woman, Isabel I of Castile, according to the biblical phrase, that will extend her powerful hand to him, so that he will fulfill his providential mission, to open a new world to the civilization of the crucified. Rosoli de Lorgues, 1874, PRL. Footnote: in this story we can observe the idea that I have called symbolic Canaan, which I mentioned earlier, also the expiatory urgency, typical of monotheocentric colonialism. We also observe the identification of Christian monotheism with Jewish monotheism, by which Christianity as spiritual Israel claims to have been divinely inspired by the same expansionist impulses that first manifested within the chosen Israel. It is assumed that God does not change his mind, therefore his laws are fixed, eternal, and immutable, hence the laws of physics and moral laws are governed by the same divine hand. If the universe is subject to fixed rules, it is concluded, human behavior is supposed to be too. End of footnote. This expansionist impulse, which later had manifest destiny as a new gospel, has promoted competition as the only established and indisputable reality. The discourse of one against all appears repeatedly in everyday life, Hollywood movies, in society, sport. Speaking about media manipulation, the psychologist Gabriel Ira said the following. From this perspective, the heart of the matter lies not so much in whether what is said is false or true, but in the procedures by which such things come to be considered in one way or another. In other words, the truth does not lie in the success with which an enunciative exercise describes the universe but the likelihood coefficient, the ability to be considered true, of it. In these procedures, the absurd, I insist itself a construct, enables access to a privileged analyzer, since it allows when it is disqualified by incongruity to attend to how this is instituted as truth. In this way, the set of procedures from which the truth is established as an axiom, that is, a truth that does not need to be proven, can be visible. And it is that the axiom for such, constitutes certainties, these summon adhesions, and from them the consensuses that legitimize them are formed. It is the latter that I call the truth effect. Ira, 2000. The representation of the American hero, embodies in itself the idea of a divinely chosen nation. He is a mythical being who does not need anyone to impose his justice, the American hero is enough with himself. It is the messianic representation, saving humanity and giving his own life for her. He gives his blood and his life for the helpless, persecuted, suffering and for his nation. He is capable of ruthless killing, and at the same time being the most harmless and tender of human beings. You can fight against mythological heroes, extraterrestrial beings, against a multitude of more powerful enemies and defeat them. He is often wrongly accused, but manages to escape unharmed into impossible situations, trying to prove his innocence. Fight against all and defeat them. Based on the frontier ideology, and the cult of the pioneers, the WASPs have imposed the model of the self-made man and the oversizing of voluntarism. If you want it hard enough it will achieve it. On the other hand, the word loser, stands as a paradigm of denigration, perhaps the worst insult that the average American can suffer, if it can be defined in any way. In the struggle for survival and for this way of seeing things, the condition of the subject, conceptualized as an individual, can only be the product of their own effort, and those who do not succeed in life can only be guilty of their own laziness, losers. The individual is alone in front of the world, and will be adored, applauded at the end of the film, if he manages to impose the designs of his will, otherwise, he is condemned to the humiliation of failure. Competition is imposed as well as the natural condition of man, the only legitimate formula for social regulation, the only engine of progress. Not surprisingly, baseball is imposed as a national sport. A player, the batter, faces only the entire opposing team, Johnny Self against the world. These procedures enforce these effects of truth. The natural condition of man is competition, man is an individual in permanent confrontation with the world, and with others. The only legitimate way to prevent this struggle from becoming a carnage is through the seduction of incentives, economic, regulated in such a way as to benefit personal fulfillment. Corollary: the only possible paradise is constituted from the consolidation of the market law regulated by the contractual agreements. This truth is imposed, as is logical, not only in the interior of the United States. Manifest destiny forces it to be transformed into militant truth. The market missionaries expand it, if necessary by force, beyond the borders. Freedom, in this sort of mercantile monotheism, cannot be more than free movement of capital and free contract. The very condition of the so-called third world countries corroborates this hypothesis. They are losers, victims of their own incompetence. Ira, 2000. According to Mircea Eliade, when a territory is taken over, either from a colonialist point of view, it is explored, and rituals are performed that symbolically repeat the act of creation. The uncultivated area is first cosmicized, then inhabited. In this way, the heavenly reign of the monotheistic God must be repeated simultaneously on earth, through the human representation of the monarch. That bloody warrior God, who has led his chosen people to conquer the promised land, must constantly seek to discover new promised lands to continue his conquests, annihilating, plundering and expelling the pagan nations that they inhabited it. Earthly events are elevated to a heavenly dimension. The king, the hero, or the earthly conqueror must fulfill in this world a mission similar to that carried out by a king who rules in the heavens. War often reproduces a war that is fought in the cosmos that takes place on a higher plane, heavenly, in the afterlife, where God fights against the invisible hosts of evil. According to Mircea Eliade, a territorial conquest becomes real after the inauguration ritual. The ritual is a copy of the primordial act of repetition of the creation of the world. A primordial action is renewed. Whether it is raising an altar, offering a sacrifice or performing a ritual. Any territory that is occupied to be inhabited, is transformed from chaos into cosmos, becoming real, sacred. The repetition of the imitation of a celestial archetype. The temples, the city, the rivers, and even the territory have celestial models. That is, a river can have its model in a star, the mountains, or a temple have a prototype in the sky, so that each action is presented in its double aspect. The earth may correspond to another heavenly earth that represents the true reality. Having a heavenly model gives it validity and reality. Any sacrifice is the repetition of the act of creation. The Spanish and Portuguese conquerors took possession in the name of Jesus Christ, of the islands and continents that they discovered and conquered. The installation of the cross was equivalent to a justification and the consecration of religion to a new birth, thus repeating the baptism, act of creation. In turn, the British navigators took possession of the conquered regions in the name of the King of England, New Cosmocrator. Iliad, 1985, p. 18. In this way we can affirm that there is a heavenly monotheism and an earthly monotheism. In earthly monotheism, violence, war, colonialism, bloodshed, represents the double aspect of the wars that are fought in the celestial realms. I mean the constant wars between the hosts of evil and the spiritual forces commanded by the only God. It is precisely in the West and Middle East where constant conflicts emerge, the brutal colonialism of the European powers throughout the world, the World Wars, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Spanish Civil War, violent racism, Nazism, fascism, systematic authoritarianism, the Russian Revolution, the Armenian Genocide, the war in Vietnam, the war in Korea, the Cold War, American military interventionism on our continent, the war in the Gulf, planetary pollution, the war in Iran-Iraq, the Kosovo War, the Syrian Civil War, the wars in the Middle East, the Inquisition, the 80-year wars in the Netherlands, the wars of religion in France, the Crusades, the various religious sects that, despite of their confused and mixed beliefs, deep down they are influenced by these same monotheocentric forces of the West, the Order of the Solar Temple, the sect of Davidians, the Gate of Heaven, the Supreme Truth. A. The sect of the Temple of the People of the Disciples of Christ. Among many others whose mention would be tiresome. Monotheism has a certain connection with sectarianism and religious secrecy. Estrada affirms that. Finally, the Muslim tradition arises linked to the holy war of the Prophet and has a long warrior tradition, currently being one of the most worrying factors for peace between peoples. This is shown in the violence of Islamist groups against other religions in Asia, or in the potential for aggressiveness and destruction that has been unleashed among the Taliban in Afghanistan, in Algeria, or in some areas of Africa. There is no doubt that monotheisms have been a specific cause of violence at many times in their history and continue to be so today. Estrada, N.D., p. 277. Social movements for diversity, pluralism, tolerance, and respect for differences, the shift from singular to plural, can be interpreted as the gradual passage from monotheism to social and cultural polytheism. From the sanctity of the religious insofar as it is linked to God, the contingency and historicity of the human mediations in which it is embodied is forgotten. This leads to the absolutization of hierarchical authority, which sometimes degenerates into a true cult of personality. The religious institution is also sacralized from the fundamentalism of the origins, the fundamentalism of the tradition, and the violence of the sacred is legitimized, which assumes millennial and messianic forms. There is a mutual implication between the conception of God and social power in such a way that depending on how God is understood, so is power perceived, since there is always interaction between divine omnipotence and human forms of power. In the case of Christianity, history has oscillated between the hierocracy that gave the popes temporal power as representatives of God, the sovereign pontiff, and the Caesaropapism in which the monarch elected by the grace of God represents the power divine in this world and arrogates to himself ecclesial and religious powers. This dynamic is repeated in all biblical monotheisms. Estrada, N.D., p. 290. Any attempt at social change must first seek a change in the religious field. The idea we have of ourselves must be modified, which generates strong resistance. The monotheocentric expansionist forces resisted Copernicus' observations, then Darwin's theories, and later Freudian psychoanalysis. At present, the effective independence of colonialism must also be resisted by these same religious forces. Religion has been and still is a source of opposition to all forms of social, sexual, political, scientific, and cultural change. Chapter 14. Science and Monotheism. The concept of humanity was born with Christianity. For the same reason, the West will be the civilization that will prevail universally. We can then speak of a monotheistic civilization. This monotheistic concept of humanity had neither China nor India, nor the original nations, nor the polytheistic religions, which have been in a certain sense less intransigent. From a European perspective, these cultures will be considered as passive, childish, in a state of innocence. It is also important to note that in the West the concept of the subject as an isolated and separate entity arises for the first time. The concept of subject or individual did not exist prior to the 14th century. It is significant to remember that during the 16th century, for the first time, the concept of work acquired a divine significance when related to Protestant theology, inducing as a consequence the compulsion for work, frenzied and anxious activity. As technology advances, the concept of nature and of being human is increasingly separated, causing subsequent ecological disasters as a consequence. For the first time, racism acquired a scientific character during the 18th and 19th centuries. The monotheocentric influence has generated as a consequence a scientific monotheism, that is to say, the original contents of a religious nature have been historically transmuted and secularized under scientific forms. For Newton and Descartes the one God established the immutable and invariable laws of the cosmos. Comte, inspired by these same Christian-centric and monotheocentric forces, supposes an evolution that goes from a theological stage, making a linear, ascending, and consecutive journey, passing through the metaphysical stage until reaching a positive stage. Europe is on the cusp of this development. According to this theory, polytheism constitutes barbarian, backward, and primitive religions. On the other hand, monotheism will gradually approach civilization and progress. Sociology will then occupy a hegemonic place in the pantheon of sciences. Let us remember that transmutation is not synonymous with substitution. One content is not abruptly substituted for another. The contents are taking new forms and reaching various destinations, gradually distorting and turning into different forms, but preserving certain previous contents. Even if it was possible to overcome the first stages, the monotheistic content will continue to throb and latent. In his own positive theory, the idea of a single God has been distorted under the manifestation of a single hegemonic science. The contents that make up the divine uniqueness continued to be present under the scientific uniqueness, from which sociology preserved certain already secularized divine components. Monotheism requires achieving the unity of all things without respecting the differences between them. It is incapable of respecting the many lost indigenous cultures because it has to impose the only truth on humanity. Such is what the history of the human race teaches us, affirms Lastaria. Humanity has begun by being a fetishist and a polytheist simultaneously, that is, by supposing material, intellectual and moral phenomena ruled by so many other divinities, for assuming a superior force in all objects of a marked individuality, which seemed to have a will and a force that were their own, hence the adoration of many gods, polytheism, and the adoration of the stars and natural beings, the fetishism. Developed this almost instinctive manifestation, the spirit proceeded to make abstractions, assuming the existence of intermediary entities, essences, and virtues that served the gods to govern the phenomena that governed respectively, and in this way, from the beginning, the theological way of thinking and the metaphysical mode coexisted in the spirit, while the belief in the invariable laws of nature that constitutes the positive mode of thinking slowly made its way through the other two, as observation first discovered in a certain class of phenomena, then in another, the laws to which they are really subjected. This progress in positive knowledge was the one that mainly determined the transition from polytheism to monotheism, in the theological conception of the universe. The idea of a single God slowly made its way, contributing to its triumph the metaphysical way of thinking, which served as a powerful aid to the positive spirit in its struggle against the predominant form. Last aria, 1875, pages 40-41. The influence of monotheocentrism in our culture tends to ignore multiplicity, diversity, multiculturalism, plurinational states. We can speak of a monotheistic Eurocentrism, where uniqueness, the unrepeatable, the quality of being unique over the diverse is hierarchized. We can also speak of a cultural polytheism, which represents a severe blow to monotheocentrism. We are moving from a scientific, political, sexual, social, and aesthetic monotheism to an ideological polytheism. The religious theological analysis is very important. The expansionist forces are based on these foundations, therefore if we manage to modify its structure, we can shake a whole building of absolute convictions. In his research on Moses and the monotheistic religion, Sigmund Freud came to the conclusion that the three monotheistic typologies have been built by the influence of Egyptian monotheism, with Moses as an intermediary. If your hypothesis were true, then the cultures of the Middle East and West would be to some extent influenced by Egyptian culture. This should not surprise us. We have already mentioned in this work several terms, geographical places, and Egyptian names that appear in the reading of the Torah, or Pentateuch. However, it will be a difficult undertaking to ensure that these evidences are taken into account, for fear of the collapse of an entire structure of ideas considered as the only truth. It would have to be admitted that our civilization does not sink the roots of its knowledge in that linear process that emerges from a Hellenocentric historical moment, and that extends far beyond in time and geographical space. In the same way that we see it in Hebrew monotheism, Freud sees in Egyptian monotheism imperialistic, universalistic, exclusive, and intolerant forces. Freud states that this imperialism came to be reflected in religion.